Good evening, everyone, and thank you, as always, so much for joining. I've posted in the chat group the link to the handout for today's shiur, in case anyone didn't see it. And as per the normal format, I'll put everyone on mute. But if you want to ask a question on the shiur, please unmute yourselves. Now, the topic I wanted to look at today is a discussion around the place of malachim, angels, and their relationship to human beings. Now, the obvious direction to go in on this topic is the story at the beginning of VaYera, when three visitors arrive at Avram's house, and the nature of the encounter isn't entirely clear, but at least one reading of the Parsha is that these visitors are malachim, and that certainly seems to be the continuation of the story. Nonetheless, I didn't want to take that track, though we may do so in another year. There's a very important discussion around this whole story and what it tells us about malachim, but I wanted to look at something else. And the idea I'm going to share is based on a Meshech Chochmah, but Meshech Chochmah that I heard the first time from the late and much missed Rabbi Shmuel of the Gostrok's shul in Golders Green, and therefore I dedicate this shiur in his Le'iloi Nishmaso. I had the great privilege and pleasure throughout my childhood of learning Torah from him. I grew up on the Ridgeway near where his shul was, and he's a cousin also of ours. And this idea that I'm going to share is something that I first heard from him, and I'm going to extend it in a slightly different direction. The primary source that we're going to look at is the Meshech Chochmah, Rameh Simcha of Dvinsk, who lived in the second half of the 1800s and first quarter of the 1900s. He was a phenomenal individual. He was a Rav of Dvinsk. He was perhaps the last great figure in history who combined being a master halachist, a philosopher, and a makubal. We'll see actually in this shiur and in other shiurim that there are often tensions in perspective between those who are particularly inspired and learn from the Mahalach, the path of the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, and the other philosophically inclined Rishonim, and those who follow more the thinking of the Mekubalim. The Meshech Chochmah, Rameh Simcha of Dvinsk, succeeded in combining both. He was a master grammarian. He was a London who wrote a very important work in Lomdus on the Rambam. And he was a Parshan. He wrote a Perush on the Torah, in which he was part of the generation, along with the Ksav Kabbalah and Samson Raphael and others, who really reignited a focus on Peshat. It's a very interesting figure that combined a lot of different qualities. And the stories about him are legends. He was a dedicated Rav of Dvinsk, who served his community throughout the First World War. Despite Dvinsk being bombed and suffering very heavily, a very remarkable individual, and his Torah in the Meshech Chochmah is original and exceptionally beautiful. And I just really want to share one insight on the stories, on a detail really of the stories that we read about in this week's Sedra. But our journey really starts in last week's Sedra, which describes the first time that Hagar was expelled from Avram's house, and this is at the in Parsha's Lech Lecha, in the top source on page 1 in the handout. Avram Sarai suggests to Avram that he should marry Hagar, and indeed in Bereshis chapter 16, pasuk Aleph, pasuk Beis, pasuk Gimel, Avram follows Sarai at the time's advice. He takes Hagar as a wife. Hagar falls pregnant and begins mistreating her mistress. Pasuk Daled, pasuk 4. She begins mistreating Sarai, and in a very difficult episode, Sarai turns on Avram and says, "This is your responsibility." Avram accedes to her request, and in Pasuk Vav he says, "You can do what you want with her," and she persecutes Hagar such that Hagar feels a need to run away. So unlike the second story, this isn't an expulsion, but is rather Hagar deciding to leave. Vativrach miponea, Hagar runs away in Pasuk Vav. In Pasuk Zayin, Pasuk 7, she encounters a malach, an angel, and the message of the malach is going to be that she should return home despite the difficulties, because she is going to have a son who will prove to be the ancestor of a great nation, and this son will be Yishmael. Now, the Meshech Chochmah picks up on a nuance of language, which we should look at in Pasuk Tes. And the way the Malach communicates to Sarah in Pasuk Tes, Vayomer la Malach Hashem. It's a Malach Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, who speaks to Hagar. So this is a Malach Hashem who speaks to Hagar. And Hagar is surprised by this encounter. Look at Pasuk 13. Vatikra, she calls the name of Hashem. I see I've put Yud-Kei Vav-Kei here. I haven't correctly separated the names. So if you've printed out these source sheets, please don't dispose of them in a regular manner. Make sure they get put in Shemus. I apologize for that. I've put Yud-Kei Vav-Kei over here. If it's on your computer screen, you don't need to worry. She names the place Be'er L'chai Roi, which I didn't print in the source sheet. And then she speaks about Hashem, her encounter with the Malach, and she's surprised. She calls in the name of the Lord, and she says, Hagam halom ra'isi acharei roi. What a surprise that even here I have seen him that sees me. Says Rashi, this is the last pasuk of Yud Gimel, Hagam halom lashon tema, she's surprised. V'chi savura hi'isi she'af halom b'midbaros ra'isi shluchei shalmachim acharei royos on b'veisei shel Avram. So Rashi translates the pasuk. She's surprised. Even here, am I going to see a malach of Hashem? Am I going to see Hashem? After I've already seen the malach of Hashem in the house of Avram. Shesham ha'yisi regila l'reis malachim. In the house of Avram, it was regular, frequent for me to see angels, and so on. And so Rashi carries on. So Hagar expresses surprise that she sees an angel, despite her being in the midbar outside the house of Avram. She says, in the house of Avram, malachim are common, but I'm amazed that I see an angel even here. We now turn to the second time Hagar leaves the house of Avram, and this is at the bottom of page 1. And this is the story of the story of, sorry, at the bottom of page 1, that's the source. This is the story of the birth of Yitzchak. And after Yitzchak is born, Sarah doesn't like the relationship between Hagar, between Ben Hagar, the son of Hagar, Yishmael, and Yitzchak. So let's have a read of the psukim at the end of page 1. Vashem pokat Sarah kasher Omar, pasuk 1. Yitzchak is born, pasuk beis, v'atar v'tzedet Sarah Avram Ben. Yitzchak is born. Vayikra Avram Hashem b'noi hanoled lo Yitzchak. Pasuk 3. Pasuk 9. Vatera Sarah ban Hagar mitzvahs. She older Avram Tzachik. She sees Yishmael somehow making sport of Yitzchak. Vatomen Avram Gorash ha'Omar hazos. Expel this Hagar, this maidservant. Ve'espana ki lo yirash ben ha'Omar hazosim b'niyam Yitzchak. She's not happy with their relationship. We know the continuation of the story. Avram is not happy about having to expel Hagar and Yishmael. Hashem confirms the correctness of Sarah's instruction, and in pasuk 14, an episode that's counted as one of the nisyonos, one of the trials of Avram. Vayashkim Avram baboker. Avram gets up early in the morning. Vayikach lechem v'chamas mayim, etc. He gives Hagar supplies, and he sends her out to the midbar. Pasuk 15. Vayichla hamayim. The water runs out. And they are struggling with thirst. Yishmael is ill. She sits away from him. Pasuk 17. Vayishma Elokim es kol hana. Elokim this time hears the voice of the lad. Vayikra malach Elokim el Hagar min hashamayim. And an angel of Hashem, Elokim, calls to Hagar from heavens and addresses Hagar, and says, don't be afraid, because Hashem has heard the distress. Don't worry, you will find water, which indeed is what happens. and Yishmael will become a great nation. Now, the Meshech Chochmah picks up on the nuance of language over here and points out that whilst in the previous episode it is Malach Hashem and it's Vayomer, he just speaks to her, in this episode it's Vayikra Malach Elokim al Hagar min Hashemayim. It's the Malach calling to Hagar from the heavens. So it's Elokim and it's min Hashemayim, it's from the heavens, as opposed to speaking, which implies a greater degree of closeness. Let's have a look at the Meshech Chochmah in the middle of page 2. Vayikra Malach Elokim al Hagar min Hashemayim. Hine beParshas Lech Lecha, in the same parallel story of Lech Lecha, Kosav Vayomer Malach Hashem. There it's Vayomer Malach Hashem. So we have two parallel stories. In both stories, Hagar leaves the home of Avram. Both times she encounters an angel in the desert. But one time it's Vayomer Malach Hashem. The second time it's Vayikra Malach Elokim min Hashemayim. Why, says the Meshech Chochmah? She could speak to the angel like with a regular human being. She was used to angels because they were frequent in the house of Avram, as we saw Rashi said. She expressed a surprise and she's shocked and she says, oh, wow, even here in the desert I'm meeting an angel that I was used to meeting in the house of Avram. And she was going to go back to the house of Avram. Don't forget, in the first story, she isn't expelled, she chooses to leave. And the very message of the Malach is, go back home. Aval Khan, but here in the second episode, where this is an irrevocable split, she's sent out of his house. She's not going to return, at least according to the simplest pshat and the psukim. The Malach doesn't tell her to return. On the contrary, she sets up home elsewhere. Kosov min hashamayim. Now the Malach calls from the heavens. Shirak kolo shama avalo rasa. So she hears him from the distance, but she doesn't experience this angel directly. So this is the Meshech Chochmah's answer, that this is indicating a lower level of access and connection to the Malach. The first time round, she's a member of Avram's household. She is frequented by angels. She's on a higher spiritual level. And therefore, Vayomer, she speaks directly to the angel. The second time around, it's Vayikra min Hashemayim. This is a less close relationship. It's calling from the heavens. She experiences the voice, but this is a lower degree of prophetic encounter with the Malach. However, the Meshech Chochmah now says there is a difficulty in this interpretation. Because let's turn to the end of the Sedra, the story of the Akedah. And this takes us to chapter 22. We're not going to go through the whole story of the Akedah, but as we know, in a very difficult episode, Avram is instructed to offer up his son Yitzchak, and he agrees to do this, remarkably. At the very last moment, with a knife in his hand, Avram is instructed to stop, not to carry out this act. Look at Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayikra Elav Malach Hashem min Hashamayim. So at the bottom of page 2 over here, the story of the Akedah. And who is it that addresses Avram? It's Malach min Hashamayim. In fact, I didn't print this, but the sources carry on like this. There's a whole conversation, as we know, if we remember the story. The Malach tells Avram not to sacrifice Yitzchak. The Malach stops him doing that. Avram says, can I still do something? Vayikra Malach Hashem al Avram Sheinis min Hashamayim. And he says, I'm going to bless you. And eventually Avram calls the place Hashem Yerah. He names it as a place where he has a revelation of Hashem in his life. However, Avram's description, the Pasuk's description of the encounter, is consistently min Hashamayim, from on high, from the heavens. Now, surely, if the theory of the Meshech Chochmah is correct, that a Malach who is closer is referred to as Vayomer Malach Hashem, and Hagar is because she's left the house of Avram, that it's Vayikra, it's calling down from on high, why at the Akedah is the Malach described as being distant rather than up close, based on the Meshech Chochmah's theory that the distance of the Malach indicates an aloofness and a removal? So let's go back to the Meshech Chochmah in the middle of page 2 and see how he answers this. Third last line in the first column, Umasha Kosov bi'Akedah Vayikra Malach Hashem el Avram Sheinis min Hashamayim. There it says Vayikra min Hashamayim. Hu lefi shebe'esa Akedah, at the time of Akedah, Sheyom Makruv Avram b'no l'Hashem Yisborach. Well, Avram is engaged in this incredible sacrifice and obedience and dedication to Hashem, where he is offering his own son, willing to offer his own son to Hashem, Oz hit galut elokit. This is a revelation of elokus, a revelation of godliness. Like the Kohen Gadol in the Kodesh Kadoshim. The angels weren't able to be on the mountain then. They called from the heavens. The Malach wasn't able to draw near to the mountain. So Meshech Chochmah argues that the distance between the Malach and Avram in the story of the Akedah is because the Malach isn't able to draw near. Avram is on such an elevated level. He is now like the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur, Lifnai v'Lifnim, which Chazal, in the Meshech Chochmah's understanding, say no angel can dare tread at that point. Avram is too elevated for an angel to draw near. He has achieved a peak of human perfection, of sanctity, of holiness, that even the angels can't draw near, and therefore this is Vayikra Malach Hashem min Hashamayim. This isn't Elokim, this is Yud Kei Vav Kei. There's a connection with Avram, but the Malach that is representing Hashem in this encounter is Vayikra min Hashamayim, is calling from the heavens, because the Malach can't draw near, because the sanctity of the Malach is too significant. Is the sanctity of Avram, is more elevated than that of a Malach, than that of an angel. Now, the Meshech Chochmah, in saying this idea, represents a school of thought that is particularly stressed by the Mekubalim. And the Mekubalim say, don't think of a Malach as being greater than a human being. A Malach has tremendous spiritual potency. A Malach is an immaterial, non-physical being. It's a purely spiritual being. It has constant awareness of Hashem, clearly of an elevated physical status, perhaps higher than our own, who are stuck in material bodies, struggling to live a spiritual life and remove ourselves from spirituality, who struggle to build a relationship with Hashem. And the Kabbalim say exactly the opposite. The Kabbalists say exactly the opposite. It is because of our material nature, because of our physicality, because of the difficulty we face in achieving spirituality, that only our spirituality, our ruchnius, our sanctity is true holiness. And therefore we outshine the Malachim when we perform at our best. We out-holy them. We have a kedusha beyond and a sanctity beyond, because we choose to do this, because we need to work on ourselves, we need to develop ourselves, as opposed to Malachim, to whom all of this is gifted. And therefore, if we ask ourselves, what is true spirituality? It isn't an absolute measure of awareness of Hashem, which perhaps the Malach has to a higher degree, but it is the building and the construction and the choices that we make, which is true spirituality. Tselem Elokim, on the image of God, because of our physical nature, because we need to choose. And the next paragraph I want to look at is just one example of this idea expressed by the Kabbalists. This is a piece at the top of page 3 from the Ramak. The Ramak stands for Moshe Cordovero, Moshe ben Yaakov. He was a Kabbalist in the golden age of Kabbalah in Sfas, near contemporary of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal. His surname indicates that his family originated in Cordova in Spain, but exactly where he was born and where he came from, and when he moved to Sfat is unclear. It seems like he went via Portugal. But either way, a very important Mekubal who wrote a sefer called Pardes Rimonim. He was a Chavrusa in Kabbalah with his brother-in-law, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, who we know of from L'Chododi on Friday night fame, and he died at a very young age, at 48, in Tzfas. His Rebbe, by the way, in Halacha was Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. But let's just learn a little bit of what he says. Roy, top of page 3, Roy Shanishal, we need to ask, Loma lo hisigo ha'ovas Moshe malas Eliyahu malas Chanuch. Very interesting question. Eliyahu doesn't die. Eliyahu becomes a malach. Chanuch, the character in Sefer Bereshis, a mysterious figure, pre-Noach, becomes a malach. Yet the Ovos and Moshe die. Why didn't they get elevated to the status of angels like Eliyahu and Chanuch? Why didn't they achieve the status of Eliyahu Chanuch? Shenasu b'madreikas malach. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Moshe shem gedolim Eliyahu. Surely they're greater than Eliyahu, and yet Eliyahu, Elijah, becomes a malach, becomes an angel, and the Ovos and Moshe don't. And he answers, Lefisha Ovos ma'alusam hoya shem merkava. The quality of the Ovis is that they are Merkava l'Shechina. Merkava is a technical term used by the Mekabalim to define someone who carries the presence of the divine into the world. The literal meaning of the word Merkava is a chariot. There's a whole chelek, a structure, a section of Kabbalah called Maaseh Merkava, the learning of the vehicles that carry divinity, spirituality into the world. The Ovis become chariots, they become vehicles to carry spirituality in the world. The Imkain, and therefore Imayu Mislabshim B'Malas Eze Malach, Mimalas Malachim, were they to become clothed in the qualities of one of the angels amongst the angels. This would be a descent from their quality. In their lives, it became pipelines for the flow of the Shekhinah, the awareness of Hashem in the world. The status of righteous people who are Merkava, who are chariots, who are pipes in the metaphor of Kabbalah, they are vehicles that bring divinity into the world, they are pipes that allow the presence of Shekhinah, is greater than the status of angels. Worthy to have become angelic figures, they would lose their quality. So Eliyahu and Chanukah are great people, they become angels. But the Ovis and Moshe are greater than angels. They are human beings who have become Merkava, who have used their free choice, their very material nature, to become more than that, to become greater than that. So this is the view of the Kabbalists, and this reflects the idea of the Meshech Chochmah over here. Why is the Malach calling from on heaven? Because he's in the presence of an Avraham Avinu who has achieved his status as one of the Ovis. Avraham has now finished, culminated a significant part of his life's mission. He's just passed this incredible Nisayon of the Akedah, and therefore an angel can't draw near. Vayikralo min hashamayim. The angel has to call him from on high, but can't exist in his presence. So says the Meshech Chochmah, based upon, this is really just a sample, the thinking of the Mekabalim. Now, the Rambam has a very different view of the matter. And I just want to share two samples of the thinking of the Rambam in this topic. And these are printed in source 3 and source 4. Source 3 comes from the Rambam in his commentary on Mishnayos, where he lists the principles of faith. And he tells us of the quality of Moshe Rabbeinu in the 7th principle of faith. The Rambam lists 13 principles of faith. One of them is the Nevuah of Moshe, the prophetic status of Moshe. That Moshe is a figure unmatched by any other human being. That's the essence of source 3. Source 4 is a comment from the Rambam in his guide to the perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, which we'll look at in a few moments. But for now, let's just look at source 3. Hayasod HaShavi, the 7th principle of faith, Nevuas Moshe Rabbeinu Alav HaShalom, is the status of Moshe. V'shenamin ki hu Aviyam shel Neviim, he is the father of all Neviim, the greatest of all the Neviim, etc. But let's go to the very last line of the Rambam here in source 3, where the Rambam summarizes what status Moshe achieved. And this is after he writes eloquently in the middle lines, in which he says he is the chosen of, the choicest rather, of all human beings. Let's read this inside. Second line, V'hu haya nivcha mikol min ha'adam, he's the choicest of all species, all human beings. Asher hisig miyadiyasig yisbarach yosem mikol masher hisig, a yasig shum adam shenimteh. He arrives at an awareness of Hashem more than that of any other human being. V'chihu olav hashanim, now this is the crucial line for our purpose. He of blessed memory, Higia hit aluso, his elevation reaches min anoshis at hamala hamalochotis, till he achieves the status of an angel. V'nichla b'malus hamalachim, and he's included in the status, the stature of an angel. In other words, the Rambam says, how great is Moshe that he rids himself of any materialism, he rids himself of any physicality. He has an unblocked awareness of Hashem. We human beings see Hashem through the clouds of our material existence, our ego, our bias, our physicality. Moshe has a clarity of perception such that he matches the spirituality of a malach. A remarkable statement of the Rambam, in which the Rambam in his principles of faith is saying Moshe achieves the status of an angel. This is the peak of success of what a human can be. Now, were we only to have the Rambam in his commentary to Mishnayos, we could say that perhaps the Rambam agrees, but Moshe got there through his free choice, and therefore in that sense he supersedes an angel. Arriving at the awareness of an angel as a human being, that is a greater achievement. But the Rambam in his guide to the perplexed says not like that. If one asks a Makubal, a Kabbalist, for the purpose of creation, And this is, for example, the Ramchal Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in source 5, which we're not going to have time to read, unfortunately, today. The Ramchal says that the purpose of creation is because Hashem wanted to create a human being who was capable of cleaving to God, of being godlike, of being truly godly. And the only way to give us this gift of spirituality is if we are able to choose. It's because we are material beings, because we are physical beings, because we are choosers, because of our lowly status of existing and inhabiting life here on earth. Because of that, we can become truly spiritual, because spirituality is only through choice. And this reflects the thinking of the Mekabolim, that in truth, an angel with all their great awareness of Hashem isn't a spiritual being ultimately, because they don't choose to get there. It's only choice which has meaning and significance. And therefore, the purpose of creation is us human beings. The peak of creation, the beings who choose to be or not to be, the beings who choose to behave or not to behave, to grow or not to grow, to make ourselves spiritual or not. And therefore, we are the Tachlis Abriya, the purpose of creation. The Rambam, however, in source 4 in his Guide to the Plex, says not like that. He says all we can say is that Hashem chose to create beings that exist on different levels. One level of human beings who have an awareness of Hashem through mediated by our physical existence. We don't have minds which are capable of perception of the truth and of spirituality directly. And similarly, Hashem wanted there to be malachim who are created with a direct awareness of spirituality, or if you like, pure minds, pure consciousnesses, who don't have a physicality to cloud their clarity of perception and the relationship to Hashem, and their existence is greater than ours. And the most we can say about creation is kach olam b'machshavto, kach rotza. This is what he wanted. He wanted there to be two classes of being: a class of being who has a connection with Hashem through the interface of physical existence. This is what we call human beings, and a class of being who has an interface and connection with Hashem only in a non-physical manner, as pure spirituality, pure mind, pure neshama, pure soul, if one likes. And this is what malachim are. So the Rambam has a very different view. The Rambam would not agree with the Meshech Chochmah's comment that the Malach can't be present close to Avram because of the stature of Avram at this point. Quite the contrary. A human is lower than a Malach in spirituality. There's one human who arrives at the status of angelic-like life, who's Moshe, but certainly the others do not achieve this, and they are physical beings. In that school of thought, why does the Malach call to Avram in Hashemayim? How would we answer the Meshech Chochmah's question? Why is it that Avram at this point only perceives of the Malach on a lower level of Nevuah, min Hashemayim, from the distance, if the Rambam wouldn't agree with the Meshech Chochmah stroke Kabbalist answer that the Malach is too elevated to experience Avram, to come close to Avram at that point? And I think the answer to the question, and with this I will conclude, is that the Rambam has a very different perception of the story of the Akedah. Because the story of an Akedah is an act of remarkable submission. It's an act of remarkable sacrifice. But it's not just the sacrifice of Yitzchak. It's the sacrifice of Avram's mind. It's a sacrifice of everything he knows of and is able to understand in his relationship to Hashem. Avram has come to an awareness of Hashem as the creator of the world, as Olam Chesed Yiboneh, as a force of kindness. Avram has spent his life arguing against pagan practice and this idea of child sacrifice and dedication to hachnasas arachim, to kindness, and fighting the selfishness and evil and corruption of the Sodom of the world and of the pagan Canaanite culture. The Akedah of Avram is a terrible experience. It's an experience in which his mind isn't capable of perceiving Hashem. And in the Rambam's thinking, this is no true spirituality. Avram needs to go through experience of sacrifices. Humans need to avoid hubris. We need to sometimes submit to the will of Hashem. But this isn't the highest level of a human being. This is a point of darkness, of cloudness. The Rambam believes that the primary interface we have with Hashem is that of our minds, our ability to perceive and understand and learn Torah and understand what goodness is. The gift we have from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our minds to try and understand what we're meant to do in this world and how we're meant to perform. We need to be careful of hubris, of arrogance. We need to submit. We need the occasional Akedah, but this isn't the peak of Avodas Hashem. The peak of Avodas Hashem is when we understand what we've wanted, when we're connecting to Hashem, not just through a chok, to the mitzvah that we don't understand and we need to bow to and submit, but when we're connecting on every level where our minds can also understand what we're meant to achieve. Avram, for whatever reason, needs to go through a chok. He needs to go through a time of submission where he doesn't understand the purpose. But this is a moment of darkness. This is a moment of lack of revelation to Hashem, a lack of clarity to Hashem. It's the pain of separation, the pain of distance and gap from Hashem. Therefore, Vayikra lo malach min hashamayim. This is a heaven, the angel calling to Avram from afar, because the pain of the Akedah is the pain of distance. Avram is distant from Hashem at this point because he's been called upon to sacrifice. He's been called upon to submit, and this isn't really the peak of what a human being is meant to achieve. In the Rambam's thinking, the Akedah is a necessary step. It's a tremendous achievement of Avram to submit and sacrifice, but it's not a role model of true human achievement. The regular, the high road, the broad path, the highway to connection to Hashem, it's our seichel, through our minds, for us being fully engaged with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's times when we need to retreat. There's times of distance, a relationship. There's times in which we aren't able to connect, and we just need to submit out of dedication and conviction and commitment. But these aren't the moments of love. These aren't the moments of connection, and the moments of distance and pain where we say, but you know what? This is important enough to me that I'll take it. That I'll still be committed to it because this is what a bris is. This is what a covenant is. But this isn't the depth of relationship. Avram in the middle of the Akedah is Vayikra lo malach min hashamayim. It's a time of distance from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the thinking of the Rambam. Necessary distance. Avram passes the test and achieves back to a clarity of insight of what his relationship to Hashem is meant to be about. But this certainly isn't the peak of human relationship to Hashem. This is, on the contrary, a time of distance and lack of understanding of relationship to Hashem. So I'll stop there for the Parsha section of the shiur, and we will move over to the halachic section of our discussion and use the time that's remaining to try and discuss this. I see on the chat there's been a few comments. Okay, this was just a thanks, so I don't need to pick up on those comments. Okay, we're now going to move over to halacha, and the section that we were talking about, the malacha we were learning, is the massively important malacha of Makkeh BePatish, of completing things. Now, we discussed it last week, the introduction to this, and therefore I'm not going to go through it in too much detail again, the introduction. Other than to remind you that this is an area of halacha that really is prevalent. It's so common and frequent in Hilchos Shabbos to need to be aware of what is and isn't Makkeh BePatish. We spoke last week about Makkeh BePatish having overlap with other malachas. It is the completion of something, the creation of something, when it isn't another malacha. So when I bake bread, I'm completing the bread, but that is the malacha of afiyah. When I build a building, I may be completing the building, but that is the malacha of boina. When I weave a garment, that is the malacha of weaving, of ariga, or sewing tefira, or knotting kashira. However, if I complete something, the final hammer blow of completing something, or creating something, or repairing something, or perfecting something, when it isn't any other malacha, or in itself isn't any other malacha, this is the malacha of Makkeh BePatish, the final hammer blow, even though it's nothing else ostensibly. Now, we discussed last week how this ties into the other malachas, in particular boiner, which is perhaps the most similar to Makkeh BePatish, but the point we mentioned was that boiner is about combining pieces together. Makkeh BePatish is completion of functionality. The point of Makkeh BePatish is the new or additional functionality that comes into existence, even without connecting pieces in particular. And the examples of Makkeh BePatish, I took a few examples just to bring the point home. For example, snapping apart chopsticks in a kiddush. The separation of the chopsticks is no other malacha other than completing them. Blowing air into a leather flat pack football so that it becomes a football is completion of the football. There's no malacha in blowing things up, normally speaking. And maybe if I blow a balloon and not the balloon, that would be a problem. But here, because it's the football coming into functionality, that is a more modern example of Makkeh BePatish. Or stuffing a pillow, unstitching the stitches that keep pockets closed in a suit. All these things are Makkeh BePatish. They're the completion of the malacha, and therefore are forbidden, even if they're not forbidden under any other category. Now, if we unpick a little bit what I've said about Makkeh BePatish, you will have noticed that I refer to three sorts of Makkeh BePatish: creating, repairing, and perfecting. Now, just to briefly summarize the difference between these three, creating is bringing a new functionality into existence. perfecting is adding a layer of functionality. So, for example, the final hammer blow that makes a cup usable, that the silversmith engages in making the cup usable, would be creating the cup. It's brought the functionality of the cup into existence. The hammer blow, which straightens the cup and makes it stand straight, the perfection of the cup, the last smoothing, acts of smoothing, which we discussed last week in the Mishnah, and that would be Makkeh BePatish because it's perfecting it. So both stages are adding a quality of functionality, and therefore both stages are the Malacha min HaTorah of Makkeh BePatish. And finally, there's repairing. Repairing is an object which had the functionality but lost it, and I now bring it back to life. That's the third scenario of Makkeh BePatish, and we're going to look at all three together. So let's look at a few examples of Makkeh BePatish. Well, let's just take a few examples. One example would be an act of creation, as we said. Creating something would be Makkeh BePatish, and we gave some of the examples. Putting stuffing into a pillow. I think I mentioned last week shoelaces into a shoe, or perhaps pumping up the football. These are examples of creating a new item and bringing the new item into existence. Note, in all these scenarios, it isn't about connecting pieces together. That might be the Malacha of Boina. Here, the point is that I am bringing it into existence even without connecting pieces, and therefore this is the Malacha of Makkeh BePatish. Even small changes, which are repairs, for example, would also be Makkeh BePatish. So, for example, if I have a spoon where the handle is bent and broken, and I straighten the spoon, this would be an act of repair, and this would also be Makkeh BePatish. A famous example of Makkeh BePatish of completing something is detaching a tissue from a box where it is held by a small thread. It hasn't been properly detached. It hasn't been cut away completely from the tissue that was in the box before it. And again, this would be perhaps Makkeh BePatish, albeit probably a Drabanan Makkeh BePatish because the tissue is a disposable item, and therefore not completing something permanent. And therefore, again, this would be Makkeh BePatish, even though it's dealing with a soft item, and therefore it wouldn't be the Malacha of Midoraisa of Makkeh BePatish. Common scenarios of other common scenarios of Makkeh BePatish, and perhaps one of the most common shilas that come up is repairing glasses which break on Shabbos. And again, let's just work through the principles over here. Certainly, if the stem of the glasses has become detached and I want to screw them back in, or the stem has become broken and I want to straighten it, or I want to pop the lens back into the glasses, in all these cases, this is at least potentially an example of Makkeh BePatish, because I'm repairing and restoring the functionality. However, to fully arrive at a clarity of Makkeh BePatish, we need to think more carefully about when Makkeh BePatish does apply or doesn't apply. And this is what I promised I would look at this week. What are the, if you like, the exemptions to Makkeh BePatish? When is there not an issue of Makkeh BePatish? And the first and clearest answer to this question is when the repair or the change I'm engaged in is derech tashmishay. It's the natural way of using it. In which case, I'm not fixing something, I'm not repairing something, I'm simply using it, and the way to use it is effectively to turn it on and off. So, for example, if I open and close a bottle lid, now screwing items together to create functionality is a very classic example of Makkeh BePatish. If as I said, the screw comes out of the stem of my glasses or the lens of my glasses, and I screw it back in, this is absolutely Makkeh BePatish because I'm restoring functionality. In that case, how can I screw a bottle top onto a bottle? I am combining pieces together to create new functionality, a sealed bottle. Surely this is either boina, building, constructing, or Makkeh BePatish. And the answer to the question is no, because it's made to be opened and closed. This isn't the same as the exemption of something which is temporary. In several occasions through this series on malachas, we have established that a malacha which is only temporary, if it is semi-temporary, would only be drabanan. If it's completely momentary, it would be mutter completely, perhaps. The bottle top is not maybe completely temporary, but it's semi-temporary, it's left for a while. But the heter, the allowance here, is not because it's temporary, because then it would still be also midrabanan. The point is, this is how it's made to be used. The logic of Makkeh BePatish is something has lost functionality and then restored it. But here, how's the functionality all along? I'm simply using it in its functional manner, and therefore the concept of Makkeh BePatish wouldn't apply in this case. The examples of this are really just in everyday life. Opening and closing a door is not Makkeh BePatish or bona, because that's how you use a door. You open and close it. You're not bringing a new functionality into it. It's true the room is now sealed off, and previously the room wasn't sealed off. Nonetheless, I haven't created a new malacha, a new functionality by doing it. I'm simply using it in the manner in which it is used, and therefore this wouldn't be the malacha of Makkeh BePatish. Similarly, opening and closing buttons, again, is not the malacha of Makkeh BePatish, because it's simply made to be opened and closed. A scenario discussed by the poskim is that of a thermometer, the old-fashioned thermometers, which you need to shake down to get the mercury up and down. Again, this isn't Makkeh BePatish, even though in a sense I'm preparing it by shaking it down for the next use, because again, this is how it is made. Now let's think about the difference between putting a belt into trousers and shoelace into a shoe. New shoelace into a shoe, where the shoelace has been completely removed. In the case of the belt and the trousers, as we discussed last week, no functionality is being changed. The trousers are now an item of clothing. The belt is a belt. It's usual to remove and insert the belt, take it in and out, and I could take the belt and put it into something else. Nothing new has been created. As opposed to shoes, where it is rare to insert new laces, I normally only do so when they break. The shoes without the laces are incomplete. I can't wear them. I now put the laces in. I've completed the functionality. I've brought a new use into existence, and therefore this would be the malacha of Makkeh BePatish. So this is one principle, which is use, part of regular use, not Makkeh BePatish, creating something, a new functionality, either through a repair or through completion or through perfection, would be Makkeh BePatish. A second principle is if it is a very casual, easy act, then again, which is engaged in regularly, even if it's not part of the normal manner of use, again, it would be Makkeh BePatish, even though in a sense I'm restoring the functionality to it. So, for example, a shoelace which has come partially out is not derech tashmisho. It's not like opening and closing a door, or undoing or doing up a button, or tightening or untightening a lid bottle. It is adding something. It's not derech tashmisho. Nonetheless, since it's a fairly regular and fairly simple act, this wouldn't qualify as Makkeh BePatish, because I don't see the shoe as unfunctional, dysfunctional when the shoelace is partially out. It's simply using it in the manner in which it's simply fixing it in a manner which is simply restoring it, rather than bringing something new into existence. Another example might be a hat which got flattened. A while back, I put my hat down in my seat in my study, and on Shabbat I went to get a sefer. The room was dark, and I was trying to find something in the dark, and I sat down on the seat and heard a crunch sound and realized I'd sat on my hat. Am I allowed to reshape my hat on Shabbat? Now, the heter, the allowance of derech tashmisha, doesn't apply here. It's not normal to misshape and reshape your hat. Nonetheless, it's a very casual act. You just press it and it sort of springs back into existence, and therefore this would be okay. Now, it is correct that this allowance is difficult sometimes to determine. It's not a black and white border between when something would be a repair, in which case it would be Makkeh BePatish, and when something would simply be a quick fix, in which case it wouldn't be Makkeh BePatish, and it's not always easy to determine the distinction. For example, shaitels, which become messed up. Combing a shaitel is not Makkeh BePatish, because one combs shaitels fairly regularly, and one combs a hair fairly regularly. It's simply an act of restoration. even though it's not derech tashmisha, it's not designed to be opened and closed like a door or a bottle top, nonetheless, the repair of the shaitel that is simply just getting it back to shape. It's like fluffing up a pillow, or like just getting it back to its usefulness. However, at some point where the shaitel really becomes damaged, such that it needs a sort of restyling, at that point there would be Makkeh BePatish, because it's lost its functionality and I am giving it back. I'm remaking it or repairing it, in which case this would be Makkeh BePatish. So it's sometimes a little difficult to determine the border between the two. I'll give you another example of this. I am an endless fidgeter by nature, and very often, you have these metal caps on like grape juice bottles or the like. And if you play with them a little bit, you have them in your hands and you sort of press them a little bit, they get out of shape and they won't fit back onto the bottle. And then you want to you have to press them on the bottle to reshape them in order to be able to close them. So again, this isn't derech tashmisha. These bottle caps are not designed to be misshapen. However, it's a very quick act. You just sort of press it down on the bottle and close it, open it, twist it, and it gets it back into shape. And again, therefore, this will not be Makkeh BePatish, because I'm simply restoring something rather than repairing it. So again, it's difficult to always determine the quality at which point it switches from one to the other. Nonetheless, there are examples which are intuitive. Someone texted me on the chat group privately, unfolding and folding the legs of a trestle table. So this is an excellent example of the allowance. Because the trestle table is designed to be opened and closed, this is no more significant really than a foldable chair, which you just, the foldable chair, which is a plastic or wooden chair, which you just open and close. And therefore, again, you are not bringing a new functionality into existence. The point is, you don't see a broken chair or table or dysfunctional chair or table that needs to be made in order to repair it, and therefore Makkeh BePatish would apply. It's designed to be opened and closed, and therefore the heter would either be derech tashmisha, if it's literally used open and closed the whole time, like my foldable table, or at worst, it would be a restoration rather than a repair, and therefore it would be okay. The question the posek always needs to ask themselves is this out of function or simply part of its functionality? That's the key question one needs to ask. A table which is a flat plastic surface, and let's say has legs which screw into it, that would be either boina or Makkeh BePatish, because there you are making something new. The table needs to be made. It is true that it's a very simple act, which even someone with two left hands who can't manage IKEA can manage screwing in the table legs. It's a simple act of restoration, of making, but nonetheless, that's an act of making, and therefore that would be a problem. However, simply opening and closing the trestle table would be a normal, regular thing to do. This isn't a broken table, simply a table that's not being used currently is folded, and I'm unfolding the table. So this would be, again, a chiluk, a distinction between them. Another time the post can talk about this distinction is the issue of winding things up. Now, winding up a watch that has stopped is probably Makkeh BePatish. I say probably because what would be the argument to say it is Makkeh BePatish? Because a watch that has stopped is dysfunctional. It doesn't work at all. It's not broken, but it doesn't work. A watch isn't designed to stop. You may let a watch run down, an old-fashioned watch run down, and let it stop because you don't want to use it. But in its use, in its derech tashmisha, it needs to be wound up. So now the question we need to ask ourselves is this a restoration or repair? It is a little borderline. You could argue that you're simply restoring it, sort of bringing it back to life. On the other hand, bringing it back to life means it's now working when previously it wasn't working at all. So the consensus of poskim is that this is a difficult borderline case, hard to determine, and one should avoid starting a stopped watch on Shabbos, winding up a stopped watch on Shabbos. If the watch is already working, probably it should be allowed. Why? Because if I'm winding it up once it's already working to get it to continue to work, it's difficult to argue that this is Makkeh BePatish. It's continuing the work as opposed to bringing it back to life. Nonetheless, there's a very long established minhag not to wind up even a working watch. However, watches which work, the old-fashioned mechanical automatic watches, where through moving and walking around, I'm causing the spring to go up and down. There's a little weight with a little spring that causes it to go up and down, which generates the spring action, which causes the watch to continue to work. This would be mutter. Why would it be mutter? Because at the end of the day, the watch is already working. Even winding up a stopped watch, probably Makkeh BePatish, but not certainly so. A crowing watch, probably not Makkeh BePatish, but we have a minhag, an old European minhag, to be machmir on this. Walking around, where I'm not even doing anything specific, I'm just moving around, and the watch is automatically, the kinetic function of the watch causes it to be recharged, the spring to wind it up. That would be mutter. So these are wind-up watches, very serious shiurs potentially of Makkeh BePatish. What about a wind-up toy or a wind-up swing, like an old-fashioned train set or a wind-up swing to get a child rocking backwards and forwards? This would be mutter. This wouldn't be an example of Makkeh BePatish, because this is certainly derech tashmishay. This isn't broken. It's the way you use it is to wind it up for it to go for a while and to stop. The watch which has stopped is dysfunctional. The train which has stopped is not dysfunctional. This is the nature of the toy or the nature of the spring, that it stops and starts. The watch, the whole point of the watch is that it doesn't stop. That's the only way it keeps time. And therefore that maybe is Makkeh BePatish. The toy that has stopped and rewound up, this is the way it's used, and therefore it certainly, or almost certainly, everyone would agree it isn't Makkeh BePatish. So this is a distinction between the two, and again an example of the application of this principle. Now, I'll simply add, even though this is a little off topic, when I'm talking about automatically winding up watches, I'm talking about the mechanical watches. There are watches which wind themselves up using an electrical function. The motion causes the motion feeds into and acts as a dynamo which recharges the battery of this watch. Here you get into a different issue. You get into the issue of battery and electricity recharging, where the shiur isn't one of Makkeh BePatish, but the shiur of use of electricity on Shabbos. This is a different halachic question. But nonetheless, this is an example of the concept of derech tashmisho. Now, someone posted me in the group, what about new drink in a bottle where the lid needs to be snapped off to open it for the first time, or drink in a carton where the lid needs a slight snap for first use? I'm not going to get to this in this shiur. This will be the topic of the next shiur, the very fascinating and interesting debate around opening bottle lids on Shabbos. And you are absolutely correct in posing this question, because this is a shaila of Makkeh BePatish in opening and closing the lids. Am I completing the bottle? Am I completing the lid by so doing? But unfortunately, we're not going to get up to that this time. Someone else wrote, what about wearing a Fitbit? About the winding clock, would this be permitted or not? So as I mentioned, the Fitbit is being wound up by the motion, and therefore I would say l'chatchila one should be machmir not to wear such a watch if it is being recharged by the motion, because of the circuitry issues that are involved. I say l'chatchila because the truth is, when you drill down to the detail of how it works, I'm not going to go into the technical details now, no new circuitry is being created in truth. And therefore, if you find yourself wearing such a watch on Shabbos, you don't need to take it off. Nonetheless, given a tradition that we have of being machmir with electricity, I would say one shouldn't wear it l'chatchila. There is another issue with a lot of these watches, which is that it tracks your motion. Part of the purpose of these watches is that it has a pedometer, it sees how many steps you're taking and how much motion you are doing. Now, you can turn off the tracker on Shabbos, and indeed you would be obligated to so do, because if you have the tracker on, then it is adding up the motion that you are engaged in, and you want that record because it lets you know how whether you've done your 10,000 steps a day or whatever it may be, and therefore this is deliberately recording data, which is problematic on Shabbos. If you turn it off, interestingly, I spent a little bit of time looking into the technology. It still continues to track and record the data. It simply files it somewhere inaccessible to you. So actually the tracking still goes on even when you turn the tracker off, and therefore it's still tracking even though you've turned it off. Nonetheless, it becomes a dover she'eino miskaven. This is an unintended side consequence. It is true it's a psik reisha, but since you've turned the tracker off, you have no interest in it so doing, and you're doing it just through normal routine of going. You're not doing any deliberate act to do so, and therefore this would be mutter. However, as I said, it is still recording the data, but the recording your data has no interest. You have no interest in it, and therefore this would be allowed. One final example of the clear thinking we need in Makkeh BePatish is, again, the core question we're asking ourselves is this broken? Has this lost functionality, in which case I'm repairing it, restoring it, bringing functionality into existence, and therefore it is Makkeh BePatish? Or is this simply restoring it and momentarily adding something to it, in which case it's a casual action, either because it's so easy to do or because it's designed to be done in this way, something one does with a regularity and a frequency, and therefore this wouldn't be Makkeh BePatish. Now, there's a third thing one needs to think about to, again, bring this distinction into mind, and this is this removal of an external hindrance, or is this indeed adding something new? Is it broken, or is there simply an external barrier to its use? So a very interesting example of this, as I saw in Rabbi Ribiat's book, is the difference between washing up, for example, and cleaning something of rust. The poskim say, in historical, classic poskim say, that you can't scrape rust off or use a cream to remove rust from something on Shabbos, because this is Makkeh BePatish. You have a spoon which has rusted, you're removing the rust, this is a new functionality. Now, one may ask oneself, so how is this different to washing up on Shabbos? I'm removing a layer of dirt from a pot or a plate. That's not Makkeh BePatish. Removing rust is Makkeh BePatish. And the answer is because of the difference in regularity and frequency and difficulty. It may sometimes be hard to wash up something maybe very stuck to it and take a bit of work, but in general, washing up is removing a layer of dirt. The plate isn't broken when it's dirty. It's not a plate when it's dirty. It's not unusable. It simply needs to be cleaned. Whereas the rust is something more integral, more bound to the object, and therefore I'm creating something new by removing it. I'm taking an unusable or broken instrument and fixing it rather than simply removing an impediment. So we always need to ask ourselves, am I removing a problem or am I fixing something which is broken? And sometimes the intuition is clear, like the case of rust versus washing up, and sometimes it's a little less clear. Another example of this is if one has fluff on one's garments. This again is just removing a impediment, even though you may not go out with a fluff on one's garments unless one sort of picks it off, because it's simply a little bit of dirt on it and therefore wouldn't be a problem. One has to be careful, obviously, not to scrub or scratch or rub at the garment when it's embedded in the garment and absorbed, because then this would be a different malacha, that's a malabin of cleansing. If something's just sitting on top of it and I pick it off, this would be like washing up, and this would be okay. So this is a couple of principles of Makkeh BePatish in order to determine, is it fixing, is it creating something new, is it repairing that which is broken, or merely restoring something which isn't broken. And in Yirtzeh Hashem next week we look at more examples of this, including broken glasses, and which I mentioned as an example, but we didn't go through the details of them, opening bottle lids and other common scenarios of Makkeh BePatish. But again, I hope this has indicated how common the shiurs are of Makkeh BePatish. It's a really important malacha to understand. So I'll stop there, unless there's any questions anyone wishes to ask.